Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Peter Sclafani. I'm the manager of the public policy program at Roosevelt House Hunter College. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, You to the Vote, Strategies for Increasing Voter Mobilization. Coming on the heels of record turnouts during the 2020 elections, state legislatures nationwide have moved to restrict access to the ballot under the guise of securing future elections, even with no evidence of mass voter fraud. The voting process should be simple, convenient, and fair for everyone. Unfortunately, obstacles to voting prevent millions of Americans from ever making it on the voter rolls or to the polls. Other hurdles, such as long lines, limited voting times, or malfunctioning voting equipment, can block many more citizens from voting. In communities of color, low-income communities, and students and seniors are especially vulnerable. With new laws already enacted or under consideration in states like Georgia, Florida, and Arizona, and elsewhere, the state of New York has an opportunity to lead by example by expanding access to the ballot. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Dr. Charles Tien, professor of political science at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, CUNY, and an expert on US Congress and national politics. Thank you all for joining us for this important conversation today. And before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone in attendance that if you have a question for our panelists during the program, you may ask it by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and then typing your question. With that, I'd like to hand the program off to Dr. Charles Tien. Enjoy.
Thank you, Peter, for that introduction. Thank you to all of the attendees who are here on a beautiful summer afternoon. And so your devotion to the topic is appreciated. And in New York, we're in the midst of a primary election, and so voting is getting a lot of attention. The state legislature in Albany is working on some voting reforms. States all over the country have introduced reforms to restrict the ballot. Other states have introduced reforms to expand the ballot. At the federal level, HR 1 and S1 have been approved by the House, but it's sitting in the Senate, which would also reform voting in the United States. And so this is a very timely panel, and we have a wonderful group, I think, here to talk about what's happening in New York, why it's important to vote, and what each of you panelists, what each of you students can do to try to influence the outcome of reforms that are being proposed in New York right now. And so we have Jarrett Berg, who is the co-founder and also Voting Rights Council at Vote Early New York. Jarrett, thank you for being with us. We also have Jacob Besner, Field Manager and Deputy Get Out the Vote Coordinator and Broome County Absentee Canvass Coordinator for Anthony Brindisi's 2020 congressional campaign. Jacob, welcome, and thank you for joining us here at Roosevelt House. Brianna Sia is the founder and CEO of Generation Vote. She's also at the Brenner Center for Justice at NYU. Brianna, thank you also for spending this afternoon with us. Lulu Friestat, welcome. Lulu is the Executive Director and co-founder of Smart Elections. It's a nonpartisan project targeting national election reform. Lulu, thank you, and welcome to Roosevelt House and Hunter College. And our last panel member is Timothy Hunter. Timothy is a former CUNY student leader and chair of the University Student Senate. Welcome, Timothy. So I was polling the panelists earlier, and most of them are political science majors. And so for those of you right in the audience who are political science majors or are thinking about becoming a political science major, you can see here right a wonderful collection of successful political science majors who are now using what they learned and applying it to the real world. And not only that, helping change the world for the better. So if you have questions about, how they got to where they are and what they do on a daily basis, you can also ask them when we end for audience Q&A. And so I would ask all of the audience members, right, to use the chat function to ask questions when the formal presentations are over. I will read through the questions and direct the questions towards each of the panelists. So we're going to start with presentations of about 5 minutes each, and then I will ask a series of follow-up questions, and then we will open it up to the audience. So we're going to start with Jarrett Berg. Jarrett, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be with you folks. I want to say a quick thanks to Emmanuel, Peter, and Roosevelt House at Hunter College for organizing this important and timely discussion on civic engagement and strategies for increasing voter mobilization. It's a good topic, and that framing acknowledges a few things about the system that exists today, because we're not living in a vacuum, and the struggle for voting rights in America isn't new. It's also not likely to end anytime soon. This is the ongoing work of forming that elusive, more perfect union. So thank you to all of you for joining on a beautiful, almost summer afternoon, outside of the traditional rush to a general election. We do have a primary coming up that's incredibly important in New York, but this is the time in the election cycle writ large to think about how can we improve the system as we find it. So I come at this work from an international human rights perspective, but we are engaged in helping to answer these questions in New York and beyond every day. And my colleagues on this panel do great work in their respective spaces. I'm thrilled to work in coalition with them. So I run a nonpartisan nonprofit. We're a public charity. It's called Vote Early NY. There's two prongs to what we do. We were built out in 2019. We focus on educating the public to make sure that folks are aware of their voting rights in America, but under New York's fairly complex election law. And the second prong of what we do is to advocate among election officials and policymakers to improve the system as we find it and help build out the voting system we'd like to see from a 2021 perspective. And that includes the classic toolkit, right? Activate, legislate, litigate, and rinse, wash, repeat. Why is this needed? It's needed because for years, as
Jarrett, I think we lost your connection. Maybe if you turn off your video, if you're still connected, that would improve your bandwidth so we could at least still hear you.
I just got disconnected. Can you hear me? Better? Okay. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you. You might want to leave off your video. So
I will do exactly that. Thank you.
Okay,
sorry. Just to jump in where I think I was describing why we built out Vote Early New York. We are still playing catch up in New York State. And so we want to empower communities to know their rights so they can protect themselves and to push administrators to implement new policies that meet our modern expectations about participating and what it means to exercise your rights. I think the essential question today's program raises is how can we successfully reform our voting system so we can have a more representative and equitable democracy? And thinking critically about this, I think it's fair to point out, right, is this even the goal? And if that's the goal, is it a goal shared by whom, right? Is it shared by partisans who tend to think about the next contest, politics as zero sum, where the goal might be power? Is it shared by incumbents who, regardless of their party, the system, while flawed, worked for them and those who elected them? Is it shared by bureaucrats, those who are caught up in the constraints of the job of administering our elections and the system as it exists now, with very limited resources. And their role in delivering fair access to fundamental rights kind of takes a back seat to that more bureaucratic administrative function of running an agency and doing the job day in and day out. So speaking about fundamental rights, how do we even know that voting is a fundamental right as opposed to something less? This is something that a lot of us in the civic engagement space, I think, take for granted, but we can't, unfortunately. We know that voting is a fundamental right because it is embedded in the DNA of our founding text, right? You can look at the Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, the Enlightenment thought that existed at the time of our founding. And those documents all talk about self-evident truths, that all men are created equal, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And this is being tested in America right now. More modern scholars, a guy named Rawls, says that the concept of justice as fairness is inherent in our system of rule of law. And so there's representational government, and then there's everything else. So when it comes to our system of government and our relationship to our government, inevitably we come to the issue of civil and political rights. Who has them, who doesn't? Who do we bestow the rights of citizenship on? And what do those rights look like in practice? So who counts and who doesn't? Whose interests matter and are represented, and why? And Dr. King speaks about the arc of the moral universe being long, but it bends towards justice. Of course, I agree with that sentiment. When it comes to voting rights, I tweak it a little bit and say that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends inevitably in fits and starts toward universal suffrage. And the story of America, historically and through to the present day, each generation has grappled with the question of which populations get to vote, what qualifications or restrictions we impose on them. And so we see a pendulum pattern always in American history of advancement and then backlash. And we are living in one of those periods of both advancement and backlash right now, as is clear from the national voting wars. So to wrap up this section, I'll just say that New York is not exempt from that. There's a fallacy out there that somehow these issues are only of concern or prevalent in the South. But if you look at what Attorney General Tish James did just this week in Rensselaer County, and I'll share that in the chat in a moment, she went after a county that put forth an early voting plan that was neither equitable or fair to the voters there. And the court found that it was arbitrary and capricious, and today they're required to put in a better plan for an election that starts a week from now. A couple days from now. So America is an older democracy, and our Constitution was revolutionary in its day. It protected people from federal government tyranny, but it leaves most issues about who can vote and how to the states. And by contrast, the more modern late 20th century constitutions provide a much clearer set of language that enshrines positive rights, delivering those in the modern era with an 18th century constitution as our foundation. Is a challenge that we all face today, right? How do we actualize the goal of so much of what I've just spoken about? So I'm thrilled to be with all you young people to figure that out together. And thanks everyone for organizing the panel.
Thank you for those comments, Jarrett. Next, we have Jacob Besner. Jacob, as I said, right, worked for Anthony Brindisi's campaign in 2020. A little bit of background. Right, that I know about it's the 22nd congressional district. It's I guess you would call it a swing district, meaning that it's a very close district in terms of division of Democrats and Republicans. Brindisi won the seat in 2018, barely, and then lost in 2020 by what was it, 109 votes in a recount, I believe. And so if any of you students ever question whether your vote actually matters and is needed, right? Here we have a congressional election that was determined by 109 votes, and so that should increase your likelihood of voting, especially if you're in a competitive district. And so Jacob, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Professor Tien, for the introduction, and a huge thank you to Roosevelt House, Emmanuel, Peter, for putting this all together. I'm really happy to be here today. So where I think my best contribution for this panel is going to derive from is my lived experience working on the Brindisi 2020 campaign. I think this panel is an all-star group of people that provides plenty of expertise on voting statute, policy, and procedure. And I want to take my experiences as a way to illustrate what happens when you have poor statute, poor policy, and poor procedure. So I want to go into a little bit of detail as to what my role was during that time, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the race as kind of an introductory to what happened here. So my portfolio included, I was the person who led up the Youth Vote program. I designed it from the ground up. I helped design our texting program, peer-to-peer text program from the ground up. I was responsible for pretty much anything that had to do with the city of Binghamton, which was the second largest metro area in the district. I was also in charge of just general district-wide coalition building pre-pandemic. And probably most importantly, and relevant to this conversation, I coordinated the observation for the Broome County absentee recanvass, which happened in person. So I got to witness pretty much everything that went on in what happened to be an election full of errors, miscues, and general negligence on behalf of many boards of elections here. So I thank Professor Tien for the rundown of what happened in year 22. But really kind of to just give a characterization of what the race was like, I wouldn't even classify New York 22 as a swing district. New York 22 is a predominantly red district that we had managed to wrangle away. And that is something that's really important to understand where this margin was. So when we describe races as a toss-up, typically we say this might be plus or minus 5 points, but the 2018 election was a 4,000 vote margin from about around 250,000 votes. In the 2020 election, I believe Professor Tien cited 109 votes, which is technically the number the court used, but we don't know what the margin was. And I'm going to talk about why we don't know a little bit later on in my remarks here. So I want to just kind of chat about when we started seeing issues arise in the administration of this election, and then talk about kind of what the future is going to look like and how we make elections in New York better and what lessons can we draw from this. So even before election night, we saw issues arise with how the election was going to be administered. The Chenango County Board of Elections, which is one of the counties in the 22nd District, was hit with a ransomware attack, which shut down their entire computer system and delayed a lot of their counting abilities and even put the integrity of some ballots at risk. Luckily, none of the ballots ended up being impacted by this, but this is something we found very concerning. The Binghamton Post Office also had an issue with a COVID outbreak where they were unable to have full postage capacity as absentee voting was really going into full swing. And then we got to election night where our opponent was up by 30,000 votes and we had genuinely thought we had lost, but we were going to see the absentee count the entire way through. And as absentees rolled in, we were able to close the margin to about plus or minus 50 votes. We were leading at a few points during this count. And this is where things took a really disappointing turn. We saw in Oneida County, the largest county in the district, a scandal regretfully known as Stickygate, where basically what happened was the County Board of Elections used Post-it notes to mark which ballots had been challenged and had not been challenged. And then while in transit to the court where they were going to be reviewed, those Post-it notes fell off. And therefore, we had no idea which ballots had been challenged or not, pushing things back a long time, as well as completely violating New York State statute on how these ballots ought to be marked, as well as if people get a second chance to review ballots that we had thought had been challenged. We also found that Oneida County had failed to register voters who voted or who had registered via the DMV online portal, the motor voter portal, which was supposed to make voter registration much more accessible, especially for young people and more transient people in the state. So that was an issue. Then in Chenango County, they found 50 ballots just in a drawer somewhere a few weeks after the election ended. In other counties, not to be outdone, grossly ignored statute and court orders. And if you want to read some really, spicy opinions, Justice Scott Del Conte definitely had a sort of a bone to pick, which each of the counties and how they were counting their ballots and how they individually violated statute. So even when we eventually conceded with a 100 vote margin, we still didn't know what ballots had been challenged. We didn't know how many voters were wrongly turned away. So what I think this story illustrates is the need for further reform. Things like same-day voter registration, such that, for example, if a voter who would have been turned away because of the whole motor voter fiasco could just register in the same day. Automatic voter registration so that everybody's name is in the poll books no matter where they are, and so that we can professionalize boards of elections as well, so that we have actual experts in areas like logistics running these elections instead of political appointees. I think that these are small steps that we could take that will hopefully lead to a broader picture of a more equitable and effective election administration where we avoid stories like the one of New York 22 from happening again. Thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you, Jacob, for that up close description of what happened in this election. It must have been a very dramatic and suspenseful couple of weeks while that election was being determined. Timothy Hunter is a former student leader, right? And was also a former chair of the University Student Senate, like I said. And so, Timothy, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Dr. Tian, thank you so much. It's an absolute, pleasure and honor to be here among such a great panel of fellow voting rights advocates, fellow state university / CUNY University, City University students, and like a lot of professionals that have been like doing the work as it relates, to voting rights, not only in New York State, but all across the country. I think the first question I want to kind of like, just tackle, which was kind of like asked earlier by Dr. Tian, was does my vote really matter? The question that a lot of people ask, and especially if you've canvassed or if you've registered people to vote, I'm pretty sure you spent a fair amount of time answering this question yourself, or even reflecting when thinking about like, the organizing that you're doing, and inquiring about like, whether or not, your vote actually does matter. And since we're talking to a room full of poli-sci students, I know we don't have to break it down. But what I would say is there was one assembly member in the Bronx that ran for election a couple years back. It was a special election, actually. His name was Victor Pichardo. And believe it or not, Victor Pichardo won his election, the special election that they had in the Bronx, by only 2 votes. Right. So, there's so many cases, not just in New York State, but across this country. It may not be for Congress, it may not be for a Senate seat, but it may be for a local assembly seat. It may be for a highly contested state Senate seat, or even a local city council seat, or a mayoral race happening in an urban city somewhere in like, the East or West Coast. There are so many opportunities for you to like, influence, the course of your community, and, whether or not there's going to be certain dollars going into education or going into youth services or going into the parks department. So it's important that you recognize that your vote carries the weight of, so much, like, so many millions and billions of dollars worth of funding. So it's important that any chance you get, you vote, whether it's in local, whether it's in state, whether it's at the federal level. But it's extremely important for us to realize that some of us, when we go to the polls, we're not only voting for ourselves, but we're voting for our family members. And in some cases, we're voting for our ancestors, because a lot of us have ancestors that wouldn't have been able to vote. I know a lot of us are familiar and with the 15th Amendment that extended voting rights to men of all races. Again, just to men of all races, just wanted to emphasize that. But when we look at, the course of history, we realize that at every single, like stoppage point in history, even though like the Constitution was changed and amended back then. You know, voting rights were still being suppressed, and not just in the South, but everywhere. And you know, even the lack of reforming election procedures and election laws is an act of voter suppression, if you ask me. You know, so not allowing for polls to be accessible, you know, like not allowing for people to drop off their absentee ballot drop off boxes. And these are things that are still occurring to this day. And there are so many. I'm not going to be specific in state parties, but there are so many, you know, people that are actively working to suppress Black and brown votes in our communities. So it's super important that you get out there and vote. You know, and also as it relates to like, you know, not only in like, you know, I guess like the South, as I was mentioned before, but in urban cities, there are even more barriers to voting, especially when you have high immigrant population, people speak multiple languages, like just voter accessibility of like, you know, being able to read your own language at the polls, because we have citizens that English may not be their first language, or may not be a language that they speak fluently. And we cannot allow like, you know, like lack of translation to be a barrier in our democracy, you know, because we're supposed to be an inclusive democracy, one that thrives and performs so much better when there are more people showing up to the polls. So I'm going to kind of like take a little bit of a tail and turn here and talk about a type of voting that maybe students don't think is important. But as Dr. Tian mentioned, I am the former student trustee for the City University of New York, which meant that I had a seat on the board, you know, alongside a lot of other folks, you know, former mayoral candidate Fernando Ferrer, the chair of the board, Bill Thompson, and we voted on like, you know, a lot of Trustee Cortez Vasquez and a lot of other important folks, and each like, you know, meeting, we'd vote on important stuff, you know, even Dr. Tien's faculty contract, for example, or even funding for Hunter College's that new student building that you guys have over there. You know, so there's a lot of important, you know, opportunities that like are even outside of municipal voting, that it's important for your voice to be heard. And one of that is in student elections, because there you're picking and choosing who's going to represent you at a CUNY-wide level, at a local campus-wide level, who's going to appoint vice chancellors to serve our university, who's going to appoint college presidents to serve our university. Jennifer Rabb, the college president of Hunter College, was confirmed by the Board of Trustees before she became president of the city of CUNY's Hunter College. So I say all this to say that, you know, it's important to vote at every single level, even as we're talking about, you know, participatory budgeting and everything else that's going to be coming down the pipes for us. And election reform is not just something where it's like, okay, we have same-day voter registration, we have online voter registration, we have automatic voter registration, we're done. No, I like to think of election reform as a giant onion. And each layer we peel, we cry more and more. Okay, I'm playing. But it's more of like, you know, we got to peel each layer if we really want to make the dish that we want to make. And, you know, we can't just peel one side and say, oh, New York State is okay, so we're set to go. No, we got to peel those same layers in Alaska. We got to peel them in Texas. We got to peel them in Georgia. We got to peel them everywhere that we can, so that we have like, you know, access to the polls, the access that is, you know, provided in our Constitution, the same way that every man is supposed to be created equal and has a set inalienable rights. You know, we need to make sure that we're upholding that in our democracy. And, you know, that's something that's been a priority for not only me, but a lot of the panelists that are here. And I'm super excited to, you know, get through these questions and talk a little bit more about the importance of not just changing election laws, but organizing in our local communities, because we can change all the laws we want, but if there's no people on the ground making sure everyone's aware of it, you know, then we're not going to be able to get the success that we want at the polls in terms of voter turnout. So thank you so much, Dr. Tian, and thank you so much to all the panelists for having me.
Thank you, Timothy, for your comments. I really like the analogy of the onion and right, having to work at all the different layers. And what that reminds me of is that, you know, to carry your onion analogy further, each layer, you know, could represent a different state or a different voting jurisdiction. And our Constitution is a federal, created a federal system. And so states, right, have jurisdiction over how elections are carried out. And so we have a lot of variation in that. But the federal government could step in and, you know, make some of these reforms that are being proposed universal across all the 50 states. And I want to ask some of the panelists when we get to the discussion about, right, why not just push for federal reform and what might be blocking federal reform as well as state level reform. So thank you, Timothy, for your experience about also right, college politics. Lulu Freestat, right? You're going to talk a little bit about election security, I think, and how we can balance security with access.
Yeah,
Lulu, it's all you.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here. This is really great, and I'm excited, especially about the dialogue and the exchange of ideas. I'm going to go ahead and throw a link into the chat. That is sort of my introduction to the prom. It was a documentary that I made called Holler Back Not Voting in an American Town. And I was especially just curious about why young people especially weren't voting and weren't participating in politics. And I made that film in 2008. And one of the things, and I interviewed a lot of people who don't vote, not just like, oh yeah, I missed the deadline, but just like systemically, I don't want to vote. I don't believe in it. It doesn't make any sense to me. And there's actually a really great speech in there from Michael Eric Dyson, who's a wonderful academic and thought leader. And he talks about how if you don't vote, you are actually being played, because you might think that the system wants you to vote, you know, because of that Uncle Sam poster, the pointing finger, and it's like, we want you to vote. And when you actually get down to it, if you really think about like the type of people that Jared was mentioning, those various power centers, they are entrenched with the people who already voted. And it is frightening for them often for more constituents to vote, because who knows what will happen. It shakes up the, you know, it shakes up the whole power structure. So even though you might think, well, it doesn't, you know, the system is messed up and I'm not going to participate, I'm not going to vote because I'm not going to play their game, you yourself are being played when you do that, because maybe they don't want you to vote. Maybe they would prefer it if you sit out. So it's all about really figuring out where is your personal power? How can you really connect? And the ideas that Timothy had were just fantastic. It is, if you look at this panel, it is voting, and it is going beyond voting. It is like, what else needs to be done? How else can you really shift the conversation and make sure that your needs are met? So what happened when I made that film, what I came to understand was that one of the primary concerns that people had when I talked to them was whether or not their vote was actually being counted accurately. And so I became concerned about that and started to do research. And the more I looked into it, the more concerned I became that there really isn't that much evidence that our votes are being counted accurately. In fact, here in the US, we're voting on electronic voting machine that security experts have been saying for over 15 years is highly vulnerable to hackers and has very few security protocols in place. And in fact, as I've gotten more and more involved in this issue, what I found is that in some ways, the voting machines are getting worse. We have a new generation of voting machines now that has even more vulnerabilities, even as hackers themselves have become more skilled. And also, when you start to look at what we call sort of the back end, you find the incidents that Jacob was talking about of just poor administration and incompetence and things like that. So, and the fact that these machines count our votes actually make a lot of mistakes. So I'm actually going to really encourage you in your like participation in your, when you decide how you're going to plug in, don't just think about plugging in on what I call the front end, which is getting people to the polls, you know, and getting people to get involved in the process. Think about the back end also. We really need your help back here on making sure that all of the votes are counted accurately after they get cast. And I'm just gonna, I think Peter said that I was gonna be able to share my screen, and I'm just gonna give it a shot. And I have a slide here that I'm gonna show you. This is, can you see this slide? This photo? Okay, this is a photo from the current New Hampshire audit in Windham, New Hampshire, where they were very concerned about the results, and they people actually forced the county to have a hand audit and a forensic analysis of the machine. So what they found here was really fascinating. You see that line that says blanks 108. That's any votes that were counted as overvotes or undervote. Overvote is if there's like 2 votes for the same candidate, and undervote is if there's no vote. And that's actually a pretty high number. And you see that Christy St. Laurent, that candidate, she got 0. So it turned out what was happening with this machine is that if the ballot was folded, it turned out often it was folded right on Christy St. Laurent's name. And so the machine was actually counting that fold as a vote. And so her vote was counted and the fold was counted, and she would get 2 votes, which was an overvote, and many of her votes were disqualified. And so they found, I think there were 75 folded ballots, and it corresponded to quite a number of votes that weren't counted. So that's just one example, right? And then I also want to show you, say, another situation that they found, and this was with paper dust. So here, let me just see which one. Let's see if this one showed up. So this is blanks 140. And then I'm going to show you another one. And this one is blanks 208, right? So that's a huge difference. These were the exact same ballots that they ran through the exact same voting machines. And what did they do that was different to get it down from 208 blanks down to 140? They blew some compression air dust through the machine and cleaned out the paper dust. The paper dust in the machine was preventing it from actually counting correctly. That is a huge number of votes. When you see from 140 to 208, and you hear Timothy telling you that you have races won by 2 votes, this is just pure administration, pure technical issues. One of the things that Jacob talked about, like, are our election officials actually competent technicians? Do they actually know how to deal with the technology that they are forced to deal with now, or are they political appointees? This is a huge issue in New York. And again, we were talking about how New York, maybe it doesn't have the reputation from the South, of suppression. New York has a long history of corruption. Our current laws and statutes were built on Tammany Hall, which was one of the most corrupt institutions in the history of the country. And we still have many laws that really sort of reinforce that corruption. So it's just really important that we really start to look at these issues, especially on the back end, making sure that we do audits. The audits that we're doing right now are pure theater. We have a setup where the audit can never be escalated because both commissioners have to agree to escalate it. And we have voting machines coming into the state that are highly vulnerable. So those are all issues that I work on. And I encourage you to really think about what happens all the way through the process, from the time the issues start being discussed to the point that your vote actually gets counted accurately. And I'm going to put in one more plug for voters with disabilities. Their issues often are not acknowledged and not paid attention to. And that is a community that we need to embrace and reach out to and really think about their needs as well. So it's wonderful to be here, and I'm excited about this dialogue.
Lulu, thank you for that presentation. Thank you for showing real evidence about problems with our voting system. Very enlightening. So our last panelist is Brianna Sia, and Brianna is going to be talking about youth voting, I believe, and she's got a perfect audience since we're talking to mostly students, I believe.
Yeah, mostly students, and I see a lot of familiar Let New York Vote folks in the chat. So thank you everyone for showing up. That's really great to see the coalition come through. I want to say again, thank you to the Roosevelt House for having me. This really is a special panel for me, since I am being joined from friends from Let New York Vote, some of which have known me since I was a student at Binghamton University. And I also want to give Jacob and Emmanuel a special shout out, since they are both part of the Gen Vote family. So much love, and I appreciate all the work that y'all do. So a little bit about Gen Vote. Essentially, Gen Vote has been at the forefront of expanding voting rights for young people across New York. We were founded just in 2017 where I currently sit as the CEO and founder of the organization. And we are an all-volunteer, youth-driven organization, and currently co-chair the Let New York Vote Youth Working Group with our friends at Citizen Union, which is a New York City-based advocacy organization. In partnership with Let New York Vote, Gen Vote and our allies also hosted the first ever statewide convening centered on youth voting rights in New York. And we introduced in 2019 the first New York Youth Voting Rights and Engagement Platform, which has also been a source of inspiration for youth activists across the country. I want to start a little bit about how I got involved in Let New York Vote, and then basically end out this discussion to show you all how my experiences and our experiences here in New York State are part of a much bigger picture about what it means to fight for youth voting rights and to change the conversation about expanding the franchise for our generation across the country. So I essentially first got involved in Let New York Vote at its first ever grassroots summit when I was just a sophomore, I believe, in college, because I was mad a few months before when I found out that my friends in other universities did not have to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning to cast their ballot on election day because they had early voting. I was mad when I was reading news articles in my political science classes about litigation that was happening in the South, and states like North Carolina pointing to New York and saying, hey, if New York doesn't have early voting or pre-registration, why should we? And I was mad when I was working on a campaign in 2016 and couldn't go out and knock on doors the whole summer of my internship because I missed the party enrollment affiliation deadline. And New York at the time had one of the worst party enrollment deadlines in the country, worse than Kansas. So I was mad when I showed up to Albany, and I had no one else to talk to about voting rights in Binghamton because this wasn't a really popular issue yet at my university. And so I showed up to Albany, and I was just shocked when I saw a room full of passionate advocates who were also just as upset as me about how behind New York was when it came to modernizing our elections. And since then, Let New York Vote has become the largest grassroots coalition in the state. And we were the ones that were responsible for pushing forward the first voting reform efforts to pass in Albany in over 100 years. And many thanks to many folks on this call for that. And this included things like early voting, which many of us enjoyed for the first time in a major presidential election last year in 2020. This also included passing pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, which affects a lot of the high school students I work with in Gen Vote, as well as shortening the party enrollment deadline, which was one of my issues with our voting laws when I was a student. And so this year, I'm excited to also speak with you all to not only share my experience about how starting Let New York Vote has really launched my career as a young voting rights activist in this space, but to also let you all know that we are currently in the conversations with young people across the country to think about what is the necessary movement that we need to really talk about voting rights and make it a base building popular issue for young folks just like you all on this call, and what it also means to build intergenerational movements to make this a issue that the Senate cannot stall on for much longer, right? And so some of you may know this, and maybe not all, but the reason why people in this country, whether it be in New York State on the local level, like Jacob was sharing before, or across the country, the reason why they are targeting young people is because we are a force to be reckoned with at the voting booth. In 2020, Circle did an analysis and showed that young people basically shattered records with voter turnout of approximately 50% in the 2020 election. And so after the 2020 election, and even after the 2018 midterms, I would argue, local governments across the country have really moved to specifically target the youth vote. As of April 1st, 2021, legislators in 47 states introduced over 361 bills that would restrict access to the ballot for people of color and young people as well. Many of these efforts disproportionately affect young voters of color, since many of the voter suppression tactics used against young voters are the same tactics used to just generally blanket suppress communities of color across the country. In some states, we've even seen examples in redistricting cycles where they targeted young Black and brown voters by gerrymandering HBCUs like Prairie View A&M and North Carolina A&T University. And I raise this because we are also right now coming into a redistricting cycle after the 2020 census. So from New Hampshire to Texas and Wisconsin to New York, we've seen young folks that look like us be forced to jump over hurdles to exercise our right to vote. This looks like things like not finding polling sites close to campus, which was the cause for a decade-long fight in Bard College, which is right here in Dutchess County, New York. In some states, students can't use their IDs, but other voters can use their handgun licenses instead. Just put that out there. And right here in New York, we saw in the 2020 primary election, thousands of young people not be able to register to vote because at the time, our online voter registration system wasn't live yet in New York State. And we were working with activists across the city to try to get an exemption because when the pandemic happened, schools across the city shut down and students didn't have access to registering to vote because they didn't have a driver's license and couldn't register through the DMV. So it's very clear to all of us that coast to coast, the youth voter suppression crisis is real, and we're only going to see more of it after the 2020 election. And so I ask that all of you on this call, if you're passionate about getting involved in the fight for our right to vote in New York State, please contact us at Let New York Vote, and you can join our youth working group calls. We hold them monthly, and we are calling on our leaders in Albany to pass legislation that will not only enhance access to the polls for young people, but also, again, transform the conversation about what it means to have a really accessible democracy that meets the needs of our generation. And this includes things like mandating on-campus poll sites for early votings and general elections across the state. This also means extending time off to vote for schools, whether it be at the higher education level or at the primary school level, at the high school level. And finally, also passing a new Student Voter Empowerment Act that really gives educators like those of you on the call the tools to not only let your folks know how to vote at your schools, but to really build out robust civic education programs to make sure that once your students are registered to vote, you actually get them to the polls and maybe work as poll workers, right? Or maybe go out and work on campaigns. So really making sure that we give folks at these universities the tools to let students know that it doesn't just end at the ballot box. There are so many more ways to get involved in our democracy, and we just need the resources to do that. So again, I'll put my information in the chat. We are looking for lots of help to get our priorities passed. And thank you again for having this conversation.
So Bree, thank you very much for that passionate presentation. I love the personal background about how you got involved in this and the frustration you felt when you learned about, right, how hard it was to vote and to participate in New York State, a supposedly right progressive, forward-looking, and democratic state. I want to turn now towards some of the arguments, right, that we're hearing from Republicans in states where they are proposing and passing, right, legislation to restrict access to the ballot, and that is the issue of voter fraud and stolen elections. And so maybe Jarrett, could I ask you to give your thoughts on what is voter fraud and is it a problem?
Sure. I think, looking at the big picture, this is a piece of the larger voting wars. So just to give folks a sense, in New York, there's a whole section of the election law. It's Article 17 that deals with penalties and crimes against the franchise. And there is a whole section delineated about illegal voting. Lulu mentioned the long history in New York of Tammany Hall era corruption and the foundation of these laws, which is where they were built and where many of them still exist today. The issue of voter fraud is one that's raised often in order to justify restrictions. There is what I would actually call a sort of false choice between access and restriction, or liberty and security, as it's sometimes painted. It's a false choice because when it comes to something like fundamental rights, we rarely ever see the harm when the argument is put up for the restriction. So you'll notice that there's very little, if any, evidence of voter fraud at a systemic level that could impact a given election. Doesn't mean it never occurs. Doesn't mean out of billions of vote cast, there won't be a few bad actors. But the studies that have looked into voter fraud, the commissions that have been assembled to go after this phantom fraud have all come up pretty empty-handed, certainly from the systemic level. And one thing that I find interesting, and I have to make this point here, you contrast that with the overwhelming evidence of suppression. I mean, our organization put out a report just by doing FOIL data, just by literally getting information about what happens at the post-election canvass. We showed that 13,800 ballots from registered New Yorkers were thrown out of election 2020 on technical grounds. That's just one category. There's plenty of others. That's more than the margin between the presidential candidates in Georgia. So, New York might not have those statewide nail-biting contests. It's a good thing we don't. But what's incredible is it's so scintillating, the American gravitation toward conspiracy, that the concept that a few bad actors might be out there trying to multiple vote, which I will just say, as someone who's been involved in election protection efforts and engagement efforts, is probably the least efficient way I could dream up to steal an election, right? Tell hundreds of people they should go out and commit crimes and with no tangible individual benefit and a decent likelihood of jeopardizing themselves. So, I mean, going down this rabbit hole is one of the challenges. But I would just say there's ample evidence of voter suppression. The proposals that we've talked about here and that there's plenty that we haven't would expand voter access. But we are sort of acculturated to accept that if someone can just put up the whiff of impropriety, that therefore that means there must be all this untoward behavior going on. And fundamental rights due process requires more than that. I just want to make that point. It actually requires some kind of showing. I would say it should be, clear and convincing showing of fraud. And I also would just end with saying that these issues are very different than some of the very legitimate integrity issues around making sure that people can register and that we have chain of custody and that we have audits and that people who are casting ballots know that they were counted accurately by transparent systems.
Thanks for your answer there, Jarrett. Jacob, I want to turn to you for a moment about youth voting, right? And your challenge is you're a Get Out the Vote coordinator. You worked in a congressional district where there were a lot of college students, and historically, young voters do not turn out at the same rates that older voters do, and so. Can you describe the greatest challenges you face in getting young people to vote?
Yeah, I definitely can. And I think that there's a lot of connections and intersections from this question. So excellent question, Professor Tien. So the greatest challenge that came in the 2020 election was obviously the pandemic, right? But the pandemic exacerbated all of the existing issues that we had with existing voting statute and how it suppressed youth vote. Now, let me elaborate here. So I was responsible for putting together kind of a campus teams program with the Brindisi campaign, where we tried to get teams of incredibly active, engaged, and thoughtful students from each of the 13 different college campuses in New York's 22nd district to help coordinate voter registration campaigns and get out the vote efforts. But the issue was that due to the pandemic, students weren't even able to meet in person. Students weren't able to go to their civic engagement office and get that voter registration or fill out that voter registration form, which in and of itself is much too complicated to begin with. Students were trying to register to vote online using the DMV Motor Voter platform that only allowed them to register to vote at their home address because of what was listed on their driver's license. Or many students, especially those in New York City, don't have driver's licenses to begin with because you rely on public transit, right? So those were some immense challenges that, quite frankly, proved insurmountable for this campaign. And I'm not going to chalk that up as a failure on our part, but it's a failure on statute in and of itself that made voting much too difficult for students in the 2020 election. Now, let me show you how this manifested. So in Binghamton, we could take from, say, the Vote Early New York data that we have, as well as the data that I've seen, and we know that the student-heavy vote election districts in the city of Binghamton had some of the highest rates of affidavit ballot rejections out of any of the other districts across the 22nd district and in New York State in general. The places that also had similarly high rates of rejections were historically redlined Black and Brown communities in the city of Binghamton as well. So to put that out in front and to kind of see which areas are not getting the resources necessary to access the ballot, we see the areas that don't have access to things like driver's license and those sorts of identifications. We see the places that are generally people who might have to move from place to place relatively often and therefore don't get the necessary access to how to register to vote in your new place, or maybe that isn't something that's on the forefront of their mind at the time. And that isn't a failure on our part, but it's a failure on the part of the state in and of itself to make it easy enough to vote for everybody in New York. And to make it an even broader point, and this is the last thing I'll leave on, the reason why I want to talk so much about election administration and how it coordinates with the youth vote and how it coordinates with the New York 22nd district election is because many of the panelists have discussed earlier about how critically important it is for Republicans and conservatives who want to limit the franchise elsewhere to point to New York and say, well, New York is just as restrictive. Why can't we be this restrictive too? Well, we shouldn't be this restrictive, and we ought not be this restrictive for a variety of reasons, which is why that we're all gathered here today to talk about how to make the vote more accessible here so that we can become a model for every other state in the nation in a good way rather than the bad way.
Thank you for that. Lulu, your ballots, when I saw them, right, were troubling and disturbing to me because elections basically can be decided by human error or ballot design problems. I remember the 2020 presidential election in Florida and the controversy of the hanging chads. And Florida was determined by what, like 300 or some votes. And so in 2020, right, George Bush won the election because probably of a poorly designed ballot in Florida. Is that just something that we have to live with, or what can we do to ensure that you know a vote that is cast for candidate X is counted for candidate X?
If you really start at the core issue, in my opinion, the core issue is that our entire elections are run by partisan election officials, and that's really throughout the entire country. And other democracies just don't do that. If you look at other democracies, Western Europe, Australia has a neutral elections commission that is really independent, and they cultivate they have a culture of neutrality when people go to work for the election commission. That's part of the screening process. They screen for people who are going to be neutral and are just there to be fair and administer elections in an even-handed way. And if we could get to that, I think we would see a lot of things happen. One is if you have people who are just even-handedly trying to administrate elections, their focus is competence. They would hire the technologists that they need to check the machines carefully. We would implement audits that are thorough and robust. That whole process of moving our elections out of the partisan realm and into the competence realm would change so many different things, and I think would absolutely increase participation and increase confidence. So, I mean, that's and we're actually trying to work on that. One of the things, Jared and I have collaborated for several years now. When he was executive director of the New York Democratic Lawyers Council, he brought me on board to start working on a risk limiting audits bill for New York. And we're working on that and hope to introduce that next year. And one of the reasons that it's taken a while is because we're trying to figure out, is there a way to set up that auditing agency so that it is somewhat removed from the partisan politics and is made up of auditors and professionals who would then oversee more of the back end process. So honestly, competence is really where we need to go. We need to move away from partisanship toward competence, and there's so many different ways we can do that. I do want to just circle back about your voter fraud issue also. And one of the key things to keep in mind, people don't always make this differentiation. There is a difference between voter fraud and election fraud. They're actually sort of completely opposite activities. Voter fraud is where one voter tries to get it over on the system, or a group of people together, like 8, whatever people try to vote twice. Election fraud is when you have a much broader situation, like a hacker or election officials themselves, who actually try to pull a fast one on the voters. It's sort of the opposite direction of the fraud. And it gets much less attention than voter fraud, but election fraud is what we really need to be watching out for, and what we are not doing enough to even find out if we have election fraud, because the way to catch election fraud is to very carefully hand count or do statistically significant hand counts of the audits of the ballots. And then we would know if the machines were being hacked. We would know if there was corruption, because we would be in public, in a transparent way, counting a large number of ballots by hand. And that's really where I think we need to go in terms of finding these mistakes.
That's a great point, Lulu. I think we saw in 2020, right? Certainly an attempt at election fraud by Donald Trump. And so for those of you looking for a great example of what that is, we witnessed it firsthand.
And just
Brianna,
I just wanted to be specific. There was never any specific fraud tied to Donald Trump. We're a nonpartisan organization, and the attempts at hacking were tied to Russian agents, and that the Russian intelligence agency was trying to affect, especially voter registration databases. That is where they had the most success.
So that's interesting. So can I just ask you, his recorded telephone calls to election officials wouldn't constitute election fraud. His invitation to election officials in Michigan to the White House wouldn't be considered election fraud?
I see. I was talking about 2016. I realized you said 2020. In terms of his attempts to influence the 2020 election, I think certainly the calls to Georgia were inappropriate. Whether or not they crossed the line and were illegal, I'm not an attorney, so I wouldn't be able to say that. But the elections have become so partisan. This is the other issue, is that we are really living in kind of like two different realities in terms of when you talk to conservatives or when you talk to progressives about what actually happened in the election. I think they felt the way that progressives felt in, I don't know if the students remember this, but in 2000 and in 2004, there were elections where Democrats really felt like the election was stolen from them. And those were the elections that Bush won. And I think that Democrats wish that their candidates, Gore and Kerry, had been as aggressive in that year as President Trump was this year. So I think if the shoe was on the other foot, Democrats would have been applauding their candidate to reach out and push hard and fight for what they thought was fraud. In this case, it was the Republicans doing it. I'm not going to say if it was illegal or not, but what I will say is that we are living in a world with just two really completely different realities. And I think, again, if we could get into a situation where our elections are administered more neutrally, we could move away from that type of tension that we have.
And Professor Tian, if I could just add, the Fulton County, Georgia DA is looking at that very question. And to widen this out a little bit, right? There are a series of crimes that people might be committing when they seek to interfere with official government action or influence corruptly or intimidate public officials. And I think those phone calls certainly reek of that. But part of this is we need to dust off these values that we all share and maybe write some of them down, right? We should be strengthening government ethics. We should not be excluding large swaths of the executive branch from rules that would apply to other elected officials. So Stacey Abrams has recently started talking about election subversion. It's an area that Americans really just have sort of been able to avoid from having presidents sort of do what we just experienced. In other countries, that's much more prevalent. There's a longer history of those sort of things. So I just add that that is one place where HR1, where people are looking at that to say, well, maybe there's things that have happened recently that should also be considered too.
Thank you. That's a great point. Brianna, so I'm going to ask you a question here that's from the Q&A portal. So those in the audience who want to ask questions, please start typing your questions in the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen. But Brianna, you talked about right, frustrations that you experienced, and with voting rules and how that prevented you from voting. And so can you connect the dots? One of the students asked, right, between voting reforms and turnout. So what do you think would be some of the most meaningful reforms that New York State could implement that would increase turnout, especially amongst young voters?
Yeah, that's a great question, Professor. I mean, I am very grateful for the work that our coalition has done since I expressed those frustrations as a student till today. We have done a lot to pass, at least have conversations, and to actually pass reforms that have proven to help increase not just general voter turnout in states, but also specifically empowering young voters, right? So that includes things like early voting, automatic voter registration, which we finally got over the finish line, and had in other states has shown to help boost voter registration rates amongst young people and converting that to actual turnout, right? Because now you don't have to worry about registering to vote in the opt-in system. Now it's automatically done. And actually, one interesting thing about AVR that is being considered in states across the country too is designating universities as agencies to be able to be part of underneath automatic voter registration. So I thought that's a really interesting piece of how that affects young people specifically. And you know, the other thing that affected a lot of young people in New York State prior to us passing these reforms through Let Your Vote in Albany was voter registration portability, because young people are super transient, not just students, right? We're constantly moving around. So making sure that we have a system that is not so burdensome on the young folks that are, you know, moving between their high school communities to now brand new school campuses, to have to navigate all of that, right? So we have passed a few things already in New York that other states have done years ago and have actually increased their youth turnout. Online voter registration is a perfect example of that, and we should be getting that soon statewide, hopefully soon. But in terms of looking forward, outside of things like AVR and rights restoration, which also passed this year, which would restore the right to vote for folks that completed parole, we have a bunch of other bills that we have identified that would, we believe, also help increase the youth vote. So this includes things, like I said earlier, such as a bill that's being sponsored right now by Assembly Member Rosick and Senator Parker, I believe, that would actually mandate polling locations, poll sites on campuses across the state that have at least 300 registered voters on their campuses. We are also pushing things like this expanding on reforms to empower, like I said, educators at SUNY schools and CUNY schools. And so that's what we deem a new Student Voter Empowerment Act. There were efforts in the past 2 years to improve voter registration programs at SUNY and CUNY, but again, kind of pushing the conversation to it's beyond voter registration. It's equipping educators and giving campuses civic coordinators that can actually help create civic action plans and host events and translate voter registration to actual action. And then the last big things are efforts that we're pushing to change the conversation about expanding the franchise, because we believe that, you know, why is it the case that 16-year-olds can't vote in New York in state and local elections, right? There is a case being made right now that young people, Generation Z, is facing some of the greatest crises that generations have seen in a long time, from the climate crisis to crises around racial justice and police brutality, and that we need to enfranchise young folks, and not only lower the voting age in state and local elections can do that to help increase youth engagement in elections, but to also lower the voting age efforts with robust civic education efforts. And so there are several bills right now in Albany that would also propose not only lower the voting age, but also have a more robust civic education system. So it doesn't matter which zip code or which borough you live in terms of having access to a robust civic education that prepares you to vote after you register. Those are just some, and I can drop some more.
Great. Thank you for that. Timothy, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just, I mean, like, you know, it's always hard going after Bree, but, you know, she kind of always covers everything. This is like our third panel together. But, you know, just to kind of add, like, you know, it has to be, and just to reinforce, it has to be a two-pronged approach. It can't just be, oh, like, we're going to change like laws or we're going to change bills and then the rest is going to work itself out. You know, we've seen it happen in every level of government. It's just like, you know, bureaucracy is always like, you know, failure is inevitable. Lack of communication between government and constituents is inevitable. So you need people on the ground. And I think that one huge example of having boots on the ground was, you know, the way that we, you know, tackled our approach to the census. Of course, it was a little bit rough around the edges. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that our census outreach was perfect, but for a global pandemic, you know, and like where people were 6 feet apart and we didn't know whether or not people were going to get counted, especially when you're looking at New York City and a lot of other urban cities where there was a huge fear of deportation at the end of the Trump administration. We need people to be able to have these conversations with our residents of not only New York, but everywhere, and letting them know, like, hey, look, these are the different ways that you can register to vote. Bree also talked about this a bit earlier. Over the course of the pandemic last year, and I think Jacob also talked about this, there are thousands of people that turned 18 and didn't get a chance to register to vote. Like, these are people that can like influence elections. These are people that's a huge voting block when you look at the amount of people. And I wish I had the numbers in front of me, but New York City Votes is one of those groups that has been doing an amazing, stellar job on not only, like, you know, raising awareness about elections, but if you look at the work that they're doing around educating people on ranked choice voting, right? RCV is a new way that we're going to be voting in the upcoming local elections, and a lot of people are very, like, you know, worried as to whether, like, I've had people come to me and say, oh, like, can I vote 2 people as my number one, or like, why can't I just leave the rest of them blank and only vote for one person? And, you know, it's important to like kind of like have those authentic conversations, not just through like Instagram graphic, or not just through passing a bill and just kind of like doing a press conference about it and forgetting about it. You know, we need to make sure that elected officials, community leaders, faith leaders, all these people are doing, you know, the work on the ground. You know, since I work, unfortunately, in the state legislature, well, not unfortunately, but like since I work in the state legislature, I unfortunately can't comment on certain like pieces of pending legislation. You know, but there are a lot of good bills that are out there. But like, you know, that will, like, you know, increase voter turnout. And, you know, I think, in all honesty, you look at some countries where, you know, I think there's like mandatory voting. You know, like, I don't know, I would hope that in a society like, you know, especially this country where we're like, you know, so developed, we have a lot of people that like need their voices heard. We should be striving for 100% voter turnout every single election. Of course, we know that, like, you know, the odds of that happening are very slim, but that's why we need to continue to organize. And we need the people that are also running for office to take voter registration seriously. It's not just about like catering to the people that voted, that are triple prime voters, or catering to the people that have voted in the last 3 previous elections. You know, we need to bring new people into the voting pool, into our electorate. And like Bree said, you know, again, just piggybacking over everything she said, because she's kind of like hit the nail on the head with this one. You know, this next generation is going to be inheriting one of the greatest climate crises the world has ever seen. And, you know, they should have a say in what our government is doing and who's representing them and what's being prioritized, because, you know, this is going to be their world that they're inheriting. There's no reason why we should have No offense to people that are 60 plus, but there's no reason why that group of people should be determining, all the policies and everything that we're focusing on, and selling us out to certain industries that are lining their pockets for their next campaign run. We need to make sure that we're getting people in there, and we have young people that are showing up to the polls and voting for the people that they want to represent them. And I think that that's what's extremely important. And the work that Gen Vote does, the work that New York City Votes does, is extremely tailored to that. And we need to continue to support these groups. We can't let them flame out. We need to make sure that leadership continues. We need to make sure that there's more, young people getting into these groups. So if you haven't, make sure you go follow them on all their Instagrams, Twitter, all their social media accounts. I already got my notifications on for Gen Vote. So, whenever they post something, I'm always trying to share it. So please, make sure you stay connected to these groups. Thanks so much, Dr. Tian.
Timothy, I love what you said. And I want to ask you a question related to right, getting young people involved and not wanting 60-year-olds making all the decisions.
No offense to 60-year-olds. I don't want people to think I'm being.
I know at the federal level, you have to be 25 to run or serve in Congress and 30 to serve in the Senate, and you got to be 35 to be president. I believe at the New York State level, you can be 18. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so I think maybe you're the only person in our Zoom room here who has run for office, right? If you've been a chair of the university student senate. So I think we need more 18, 19-year-olds not only voting, but running for office, right? And so why did you run? And what do you think we can do to get more 18, 19, 20-year-olds to run for office?
100%. I mean, first off, that's a really good question, Dr. Tian. I want to acknowledge Kathleen in the chat. Kathleen, I understand 100%. Like a lot of people want fresh air, clean water, and clean food too. So, kudos to folks like Kathleen that are out there fighting the good fight for all of us. And are that's a generational fight for sure. As it relates to young people running for office, I mean, I hope I'm not going to be the only person on this panel that's run. I hope we get Bree in there. I hope we get Jacob in there sometime soon. I know that Lulu's a little bit on the nonpartisan side, so I'm not sure she's going to be able to do anything for us. But as it relates to running, I think that it always starts with the need, right? And what does your community need? Because when you're running, you're not just running because you think it's cool. I mean, well, some people do that, but that's not the right way to go about it, if you ask me. I think it's important that you understand what needs your constituency has and whether or not you have the skill set and the qualifications. And I use that word loosely because some people think that the qualifications are you have to be a white man to be able to run for office, which is not the case. But you have to be able to have that skill set to unite folks and build coalitions. The same coalitions that we've seen built here at Gen Vote, the same coalition. Shout out to Peter and Emmanuel that put this whole thing together. These are the coalitions and the coalition builders that we need to be serving us in office. And this is a shameless plug here. When we look at youngest state legislators ever, I'm fortunate enough to work for State Senator Julia Salazar, who's the youngest woman to ever be elected in the New York State Senate as a woman, which is an amazing, it's an amazing feat in itself, an amazing accomplishment in itself. And all she's been able to, accomplish, throughout her tenure. It's been 2 years, about to be her third year. She's been doing an amazing job. Last year, we were fortunate enough to get a CUNY alum. I'm not sure if there's any Queens College folks in here, but Khalil Anderson, the youngest ever African-American state assembly member ever elected in New York State history. We're talking about rubbing elbows historically with folks like Chuck Schumer, folks like Teddy Roosevelt, these are just to name a few in terms of young people that have been able to get elected in government and change it radically. And I think that that's what we need. We need that same zeal, that same energy. And we need more CUNY students in office, y'all. No offense to the SUNY folks, but we need more. Let me make over. We need more products of public universities and public schools, you know, in office, because far too often, a lot of people that are even like getting appointed to our boards or like, you know, sitting in these high places, making these decisions, have never experienced like, you know, the quality public school education, or sometimes inequitable public school education that we received. And we need people that are willing to go in there and change that for the better. In terms of why I ran, I mean, like, you know, I felt like tuition was a huge issue in CUNY. The rising cost of, I mean, for those that don't know, CUNY used to be a free institution, you know, back when the demographic of students looked much different from how it looks now. And, you know, since the city went bankrupt in like, you know, the early 70s, late 60s, you know, basically the burden of paying tuition has been put on the backs of students. A lot of our students are working class. We have an average household income of almost $35,000. There's no reason why we should be increasing tuition $200 every year at a university that used to be free for people that don't look like me. So we took our advocacy to Albany. You know, I hunkered down in Albany for a week with some of our steering members, and we lobbied every single elected official up there, CUNY grads, non-CUNY grads. Even we had sat down with some Republicans to have conversations about, you know, the need to invest in public higher ed. And, you know, thankfully we were able to get a tuition freeze last year. And through that same advocacy, the current chair of USS, Giovanni Piquant, was able to get 3 years on top of that. So, you know, students that have came into CUNY last fall will not see a tuition freeze for their entirety of their tenure if they complete, you know, a 4-year degree at a CUNY university. And that's the type of advocacy that we need. That's the type of, you know, people that we need fighting for us. But it's not just a one issue like, you know, fight. It's a multi-issue fight, right? Because we're not only dealing with the rising cost of tuition, we're also dealing with the lack of menstrual products on our campuses, right? Why is it that people have access to menstrual products, you know, from middle school going into high school, and when you get to public universities, it just like kind of disappears, right? You need an office to be open if you want to get menstrual products. I don't think that's right. A lot of us don't think that's right, but we need young people that see these issues and experience them firsthand, for us to be able to, you know, like point government in the right direction and create equitable solutions to solve them. I know that was kind of long-winded, Dr.
Oh, that's
Tan.
great. That's great. I encourage you to run for further offices, and all the young people in the audience to do so. Okay, so we get 1 minute each with a concluding thought that you want to leave with our audience. So I'm going to start with Jarrett. What's your takeaway for our audience today?
So I didn't actually have a chance to chat about specific election reforms, but I agree with most of the ones that were mentioned here. We have an opportunity to, all of us and our elected officials in the legislature right now, to build an election system that we'd like to see function in the modern world. I think that structurally, voting reforms tend to fall into 3 buckets: how we register, how we cast ballots, how we count ballots. Until recently, New York made all 3 very difficult, convoluted, and pretty unwieldy. That made them subject to abuse or clever lawyering. We didn't get a chance to talk about gerrymandering, but it is a redistricting cycle. Gerrymandering is just a more sophisticated voter access end run that causes distortions to our political representation, in a way that voter suppression laws do too. But on voter access in New York, we're just getting to a place where people have actual options to choose from. So we're just getting to the 3 ways to vote model that several other states have had. I think we should be having these questions in public. Someone on the panel, I think it was Timothy, mentioned he works for the legislature. There really haven't been that many hearings on some of these questions. What should voting by mail, voting from home, convenience voting, what should that look like? Should we continue to try and bring millions of people to the ballots, or might it make sense to start mailing millions of ballots to the voters? When we have a 25-day voter registration deadline, who does that exclude, right? And the last piece I would just leave you with is the mal-resourcing of elections. We see that in New York, but we especially see it in some of these southern states that have hundreds of counties. In Georgia, they're criminalizing, right? They have these long lines. They're criminalizing handing out water to elderly people when they should be prohibiting a county resourcing system that leads to hours-long lines. So we're sort of having this conversation in different directions in America. I like to focus on fundamental rights and building the system we'd like to see going forward. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jarrett. Jacob, 1 minute.
All right, I'll get my timer started now. So what I kind of want to leave this with is kind of like, why are we discussing reforming our voting system? Now, I think Jarrett discusses a lot, makes a lot of great points from the point of philosophy, from the point of history. But I also really appreciate Bree and Timothy's perspective on the point of organizing. And this is where I kind of want to hone in here. The reason why I think this is also critical is because it's about the environment in which we as organizers operate, right? So if we are operating in an environment where it's difficult for people to register to vote, that means it's an environment where it's difficult for people to feel connected to their communities because they don't feel like they have a voice, right? That makes it incredibly difficult for me as an organizer to go knock on someone's door and tell them, you have this ability to change what's happening in your community. And they say, well, no, my vote doesn't count. Well, that's a bit of an issue. That is a core and fundamental issue that is here. So when we're discussing voting reform, I really want to center people's lived experiences here. Whether it's when I talk to my friends who were in the city of Binghamton who were turned away from the polling places in 2020, or I could talk about, say, all the people who just generally feel disenfranchised that I talk to when I go door to door canvassing wherever I am in New York City, in Binghamton, or in Iowa when I was out over there too. That's really important. So we need to make sure that people not only have that voice, but feel like they have that voice too. And that's why we really need to center organizing at the core of all of this, because we need to make that environment better for organizers so that everybody feels like they have a stake in our community.
Great, thank you very much. Timothy, you get 1 minute. Closing thoughts.
All right. I feel like I hope you all aren't tired of hearing my voice, but you know, it's
Absolutely not.
It's always a pleasure getting the opportunity to talk about you know, like democracy and the importance of voting. But like, you know, I just like to leave you all with a charge as people that are like, you know, listening to us on the panel. You know, after this, you know, webinar, I want you all to think like, you know, what is it that I can do to ensure like that there's greater voter access in my community? What is it that I can do to ensure that, you know, our state is not shortchanging, you know, its constituents? What can I do to make sure that, you know, everyone has access to a democracy that's fair? You know, I can imagine after last year, there's a lot of voter fatigue. We had to deal with the like presidential elections. That's probably taken a toll. For those that are working on campaigns, you probably know you're speaking to people right now saying, hey, don't forget we got primaries coming up. And they're like, oh, I already voted last year. And like, you know, it's important for us to, you know, be able to convey to people that, you know, listen, like, even though you voted, you know, last year and you probably saved us, it's important that we need you to vote every year and every time you can. You know, and it's important that we make voting not just something that's a hobby or something we could do just to get a sticker and post on our Instagram. It's something that's it's part of our lifestyle and a part of, you know, the way that our country should function, because our country it functions better when all of us are participating in it and ensuring that, you know, we're creating the equitable solutions that we need for our most disenfranchised population. So I just want to say, you know, again, kudos to the Roosevelt House and everyone else that has put this whole thing together. And Dr. Tien, you're such a great moderator. I hope they consider you for Jeopardy sometime. You know, but this has been an absolute amazing opportunity, and it's been great to connect with these amazing panelists. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Lulu, concluding thoughts?
Okay, I just got word that Mark Ruffalo is tweeting for our legislation. So like my concluding thought is like, and please go to Twitter and share his tweet. So the reason why this legislation is so important to us, it has to do with the whole thing that we've been talking about today, which is like participation and inclusiveness and making sure that our elections are actually reflecting our views and our like what we want in the world. And if at the end of the day, everybody votes, but those votes are not counted correctly, then our input, our voices will not be heard, not correctly. And so that's what I work on. I work on making sure that when you vote, when you participate, it gets all the way through the way you intended. And I encourage you to join me. I am the executive director of Smart Elections. Our website is smartelections.us, and I will put that in the chat. What we are most focused on right now in New York is a wave of what security experts are calling bad voting machines that are coming into the state. They are literally saying, quote unquote, they are bad. They have the ability to add, delete, or change votes on your individual ballot, sort of like what I showed you, how the machine count the votes incorrectly. Someone can do that deliberately with these machines. They can be programmed to change your actual paper ballot. That is something that just undermines all of the processes that we are talking about here today. We have a bill to protect us against that. We spent 2 years working on this bill. I think we're going to pass the Senate today. We are on the calendar, and we need to get Carl Heastie, the Speaker of the Assembly's attention, and tell him, please, this session, we need to pass this bill. If not, we will have these bad voting machines coming into our state probably before the next session, before the legislature has a chance to act on this again. The New York City Board of Elections already said they wanted to use these machines. So we could quite easily have 4.5 million active voters voting on voting machines that security experts say pose extraordinary risks to the voters of New York. I have been in a panic for like 6 months as we tried to work on this with the legislature. I've had a headache actually for like this month. I'm so worried about it. So I invite you to join me in my panic and my anxiety. Call the Assembly member, Carl Heastie. The number is in the tweet at him, and please help us get this one bill. It is A1115A over the finish line. That is my final word to you.
Thank you. Brianna?
Yeah, thanks everyone. Well, first off, I want to say Timothy Hunter for President 2030. And that was just, thank you, Timothy, for all the shout outs, and to everyone else on the panel, Jarrett, Jacob, Lulu, y'all are amazing. Emmanuel, Peter, everyone else that's in Let New York Vote that's here and that want to join our coalition moving forward. So I guess my last remarks in terms of things that you can do like right now, I guess following Lulu's, if you're in the tweeting mode or Instagram mode, TikTok mode, whatever it is. Many folks may not know that this year is the 50th anniversary of the 26th Amendment, which expanded the right to vote from folks that were 21 years old to 18 years old, to basically lower the voting age to what it is today. And it's a huge anniversary for us youth voting rights activists. And New York actually passed it June 2nd, 1971. So we just passed New York's 50th anniversary of passing the 26th Amendment. And so if you're interested in talking about the need to continue the legacy of fighting for youth voting rights in New York State, I'm going to drop a link in the chat that is a toolkit that includes talking points for 2 particular bills that I talked about today regarding on-campus poll sites and lower the voting age. We really need your help. In the 2020 presidential election, New York had the 2nd lowest youth voter turnout rate in the country, while New Jersey had actually the highest. And so I encourage y'all to take the energy and the passion that you have for fighting for our democracy here in New York and get involved in our coalitions. And I really appreciate the conversation we had today, and recognize your power. I started Gen Vote as a student at Binghamton. So if I can do it, y'all can do anything, whether it be running for office, running your own organizations, or at least changing the conversation about voting in your schools. Thank you.
Thank you, Brianna. So thank you for the attendees for coming. I would say stay active, stay engaged, stay involved. Thank you, Jarrett Berg. Thank you, Jacob Besner. Thank you, Timothy Hunter. Thank you, Lulu Freestat. Thank you, Brianna Sia, for spending this wonderfully informative hour and a half with us. And I'm going to turn it over to Emmanuel Zabetta to wrap up.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Emmanuel Zabetta, and I'm a Macaulay Scholar and Generation Vote team leader at Hunter College. Over the past 7 months, I've had the privilege of working with Roosevelt House Institute for Public Policy on this event designed to draw attention to ballot accessibility in New York State. I'd especially like to thank Brianna Sia and Jacob Besner, 2 of our panelists today, and 2 people I'm very proud to call friends, for introducing me to Gen Vote and the fight for ballot accessibility in New York. This organization and its model have taught me a great deal, and I consider myself blessed to have received this opportunity. Also, a big thank you to Lulu Freestat for opening my eyes to the dynamic world of election security. Oh my God, there's so much in there. And to Jarrett Berg for providing me with great advice and encouragement throughout this process. This has been the first panel I've ever organized. As well, thank you, Timothy Hunter. I know you had to leave, but thank you for being a committed ally to CUNY and for taking the time out of your exhaustive schedule to be with us. I'd also like to thank Generation Vote Program Manager and logo for GenVote, Brendan Cushing, and my GenVote teammates, Valentina Vanellis, Nolan Leon, Elizabeth Ratkiewicz, my apologies, and especially my co-team leader, Annabelle Gregg, for their support. Most of all, I'd like to thank Peter Sclafani for believing in and never giving up on this event. We couldn't have done this without all the work he did to make this a reality. Finally, I'd like to thank Harold Holzer, the Jonathan F. Fanton Director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute, for hosting us this afternoon. To our guests, if you'd like to contribute to the work the Let New York Vote Coalition does, don't hesitate to reach out to our panelists. They will put their emails in the chat. Additionally, a list of internship opportunities will circulate at a later date. At Hunter College, our motto is Mihi Cura Futuri, or the care of the future is mine. Committing to this principle means committing ourselves to making voting convenient, secure, and inclusive here in New York. And just wanted to thank you all for being here.